Day 7. 0000 hours to 0400 hours. Swarf did not look concerned. Chopra had told him about the changes transforming the planet, but the shape changer just smiled knowingly. Even the order to shut the main castle doors was more of a sop to the Chthons than an acknowledgement that things had gone terribly wrong. Chopra felt frightened as they walked up the narrow stairway to the battlements. He had been sensing the Red Death for many days. It had spread over the jungle and then had devoured the marshland. He felt that the emptiness was trying to possess him. The monsters were stirring, like babies in the womb, waiting to be reborn. Swarf stood on the battlement. He surveyed the new world sprawled in front of him. He couldn't understand what had happened. There was an expression of shock on the shape-changer's face. The planet had faded into a deep gloom. Above, storm clouds veiled the heavens, blocking the sunlight, and below the red stillness covered the surface of the planet. Their world was petrified, and only 50 meters separated their sanctuary from the sea of red death. The silence was overpowering. Hunters played their incessant games in the skies overhead. There were thousands of the creatures flying above them and ominously silhouetted on the witch trees at the edge of the plain. They seemed to be able to move through the Red Death without being frozen in time. This was the largest collection of these creatures Chopra had come across. Normally they hunted alone or in small packs. This looked like an army. This was also the shape-changer's perception. "They seem to be watching us," Swarf said. "They're waiting," replied Chopra. Swarf looked up. One hunter was hovering just above the castle. They could hear the hissing of one, maybe two others close by. Chopra leant over the battlements. He moved back, startled. Attached to the wall of the castle were 40 of the creatures, hanging upside down and gently hissing at each other. Their claws were holding tightly onto the nooks and crannies of the walls. Swarf looked. "What are they waiting for?" he asked. Chopra shook his head. He didn't know. "Bring some of your men up here. Watch the skies." "Apart from me, there are only 4 Chthons," Chopra said. "If they attack, we must be prepared to defend ourselves." Swarf swallowed nervously and descended back into the castle. Chopra looked out into the night sky. He wished it didn't have to end this way. The doctor's pacing around the cage had stopped. He sat opposite Blake. His eyes were closed and his mind was elsewhere. In the few days that Blake had known the doctor, he had never seen him fall asleep. He seemed perpetually on edge. Now, in the cage, he mumbled and turned, his brain trying to sort out answers even when his body slept. It had been almost 3 days since they had first met in Hell, in the arena where the mysterious traveller had fought his deadly foe. Blake felt sad for the Time Lord. He seemed a man without either a past or a future. Something in him kept him going. To call it hope would limit it. The doctor stirred up numerous feelings in the poet. Even knowing he would die, and that the revolution stirring over the planet would not create the earthly paradise he so desired, Blake felt he could trust the stranger. Perhaps the knowledge that he would one day die actually gave the poet comfort. The prospect of eternity did not appeal to him. As he looked over at the stranger, he suddenly became aware of someone else in the room. Just outside the cage, there seemed to be a figure standing watching them. The faint light radiating from the cage threw out enough illumination to identify a motionless, shadowy form about 6 foot from their prison. It seemed to be draped in black, its face hidden. "Hello?" shouted Blake. The figure stepped backwards into the darkness. There had been a definite movement. It wasn't his imagination. There was somebody there. The doctor sat up. "What is it?" he asked. "There's somebody watching us," Blake said. "Where?" the doctor asked, peering out of the cage. "It's gone from sight. It's there, 10 foot from the cage." The doctor strained his eyes, but there was nothing to see. The darkness had swallowed up the watcher. "What did it look like?" the doctor asked. "It wasn't a demon." I don't know. I couldn't see very well. Blake was unsure. I don't know what I saw. How long have you been watching me? The doctor shouted. Katori mai, a voice echoed from out of the darkness. It was deep and flowing, offering a reassurance from the unknown. Saved me? How dare you? Who says I wanted saving? I was on the point of destroying any chance the monsters had of breaking into this universe. You were on the point of dying, the voice continued. I could not have allowed that. You could not have allowed. The doctor's accent had deteriorated into an almost unrecognizable Scottish drawl. Who do you think you are? The figure stirred and then moved out of the shadows towards them. It was draped in a black cloak with a cowl covering the face. As it walked forward, Blake saw a hand illuminated by the pale lights. The mysterious disguise hid the identity of the figure, but could not conceal that it only had one arm. The hood was thrown back, and the cloak slid away from the old man's body. A further dark robe hid the damaged frame from view, but the face had a pull like magnetism. A small beard grew around the mouth, and a ponytail weaved down his back. Blake turned to look at the doctor. He had sunk to his knees and was bowing his head. You ask me who I am? The figure's voice became louder. I am Copyion. Forgive me, the doctor whispered, falling prone to the floor. Lyal a Mahajetsu, the Lord Defender of the Faith of the Peoples of Gallifrey. The old man moved painfully, closer to the cage. His body had been damaged by some long-distant war. However, his eyes shone with the brightness and power of a great intellect. Blake stood back, overpowered by the sight of this man. The man was a mythical figure from the Doctor's past, a man who, according to the time traveller, had died thousands of years ago. Yet here he was, standing in front of them on this distant planet. The figure pressed a switch on the wall, and the bars of the cage disappeared. Blake could now see that they were in a large white room, part of a much larger edifice. The figure stood over the prostrate doctor. You may rise, said the figure. The doctor raised his head and pulled himself to his feet. Lyal Copyion, I thank you, the doctor said, holding his arm out beseechingly. The figure moved out of reach and appeared to sneer. You got in my way, Copyion stated in a cold, humourless manner, and I am afraid the consequences will be grave. I didn't want to interfere, said the doctor. No, Copyion replied. He started to walk away. The doctor waved to the poet that they should follow him. Where are we? The doctor asked. This is a deep space monitoring station. It slipped out of orbit many centuries ago, Copyion said. I'm worried about my companion, Bernice Summerfield. Do you know anything of her? The doctor asked. Copyion looked him over. You are tiresome. The woman is still alive. She is a prisoner of the Shape-Changer. I have far larger tasks than to worry over her petty life, Copyion said. Blake followed the two men down a corridor. The door opened automatically, and they entered a huge control room. Screens were erected on the walls, dials and switches flashed on and off. The screens had images from many different worlds, including medieval Christendom, an airless barren world with a red moon, a futuristic city where men were shooting each other with guns firing burning light, Victorian London, and hell. A large yellow flag acted as the centrepiece of the room. The crest bore a distinctive design of overlapping circles, resembling an over-elaborate number 8. A warrior's uniform hung up next to the standards. The items appeared to be centuries old. What are they? Blake asked. They're relics of the early Time Lords, the doctor replied. They are not, said Copyion. These predate the Time Lords by thousands of years. Somehow that triggered the doctor, and he interrupted the old man. We fought a war, didn't we? Against the monsters. Why was it kept a secret? We made a terrible mistake when the Time Lords set themselves up as guardians of all space and time, Copyion replied. That isn't an answer, said the Doctor. Copyion began to laugh. It is the answer. The Doctor looked furious, as if the old man was laughing at him. Copyion walked over to the screens. He looked intently at the pictures conjured up before him. Please, said the Doctor, I need to know. We've both seen much suffering and horror. The Doctor grasped the old man's sleeve. Sometimes I think the light flickers. The Doctor stared at Copyion's face. The old man grabbed hold of the Time Lord's hand and removed it from him. What light? Copyion replied. I am doomed for all eternity. Copyion pointed at one of the screens. Blake leant closer. It seemed to be a moving picture of an ancient courtyard. Flames were pouring out of a well. Figures were running around in chaos. Copyion tapped the screen. Soon. The machinery was rocking. The power building up in the shaft was starting to have an effect on the castle. The old stone pillars were shaking as if they were being brought back to life. The screams of the drill drowned out all other sounds. Shadows moved all around them as if coming to life. Chopra stood unsteadily on his feet. The shape-changer bounded around with excitement. Chopra could tell something had happened. Whatever had walked the corridors of the castle had started to stir again. It was no longer the voices he could hear, but movement. The monsters themselves. He could hear the wailing, like the cry of a banshee. The sounds of the elder gods reawakening from their slumber bore only the prophecy of death. A long, blood-curdling howl. The ancients believed that they could create immortality, said the shape-changer. Now we are so close to achieving their ends. We will import into this universe huge amounts of Dream B. People can then enter into their own worlds where they can live forever as gods. Chopra looked at him. This man was not mad. He really did not care about the effect of his actions. As long as he became rich, it didn't matter. His brother had died, but it didn't matter. Chopra could feel no malice. After all, they were all pawns in a game played out for millennia. Their lives were all mapped out. There was no free will. Somewhere, hands were moving chess pieces across a board. Bernice didn't like the sounds. She could hear howling. Thomas told her that it was the hunters. He had heard the voices before. He told his fellow prisoners of an attack on a colonial settlement where the creatures had made the same noises just before they raided and massacred the colonists. Bernice didn't feel like writing any more in her diary. Elle had smartened herself up and started to harangue the android about his apparent surrender to fate. She told him that they couldn't possibly stay down here, and that he had to make some effort to escape. It was his mission, and he had to fulfill it, she said. Bernice wondered if there had been anything in the cold meat the woman had eaten. She seemed to have gone through a character change. Perhaps it was panic setting in. The three of them seemed to have been inexorably drawn together with each step they had taken. They were boxed in. There was now only a slim chance of escape. Bernice didn't like this woman. She couldn't understand why the woman's husband had brought her onto this hazardous planet. But then, she had survived and he hadn't. "They're barbarians. You must do something," Elle said to the android. Suddenly, Bernice heard something move in the corner of the room. She turned quickly, expecting to see a rat staring at her. However, it was one of the typewriter creatures that had managed to dig its way into the cell. It scuttled over to her. A message was being typed out. Bernice looked at it. "Bernice, this is the Doctor. There is cosmic evil on this planet. Beware." As Bernice tried to read the next line, Elle moved forward and stamped on the creature. It was crushed, its parts scattered across the room. Bernice turned to rage at the woman. "I hate those things," Elle said, smiling. "I cannot cope with the pain," Spike thought. If only he could make a sound or move his body. He was being tortured by the hunters, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. They had flown into the atmosphere and had carried his broken body to the other side of the castle. They seemed to have landed away from the red paralysis, but as he looked around, he could see the castle being encroached upon from all directions by the strange weed. He was laid down on brittle pampas grass and then manhandled by the creatures. He couldn't tell whether there was a steady stream of them or whether it was the same 5 or 6 hunters who were torturing him. He was reminded of the behaviour of domestic felines, how they would kidnap smaller creatures from the garden, take them into the house, and then taunt them, keeping them alive until they starved, or the cats became bored with the game. He wondered whether prayer would do any good. The last time he had prayed, he appeared to have been granted a few more minutes before termination. But for what purpose? He decided that although the Prime Mover had granted his wish, it was up to him how he used that time. But with his badly broken body, there was little he could do. Spike couldn't rant against the Prime Mover. His wish had been granted, but he had only been given more time to experience cruel and unabated pain. Some philosophers argued that the Prime Mover did not exist, or was a weak and feeble deity who was impotent to intervene in the machinations of the universe. Spike could not believe that. The lead hunter appeared to have a mane around its neck. This was the creature which had picked him up and flown with him. Spike's one eye tried to focus on the movements occurring in front of him. He couldn't close his eyelid. That part of his mechanism had seized up. The leader stood back and watched as 2, perhaps 3 hunters covered his body in a gold paste. Spike watched them spit the stuff out of their mouths and then spread it over his skin with their claws. And it hurt. It was like acid and made his whole body scream with pain. "Stop! Stop!" he wanted to shout out. But there was only silence. He was powerless to stop this terrible torture. Every synapse and electronic membrane of his machine body burnt with the intensity of 1,000 deaths. He stared out of his bodily prison and cursed them. A hunter rubbed the cold, clammy substance over his face, making sure that it covered his one remaining eye. His vision misted over, and he could no longer see. It hurts! Why could they not let him die? The gel covered his body, and Spike's mind struggled to cope with the signals from every neuron in his artificial frame. He started to realize that he was experiencing sensations from parts of his body which he had thought had ceased to function. This did not make sense. Perhaps the substance also had effects on the mind. He was aware of strange thoughts and sensations swimming through his mind, but he could not cope with the pain. He heard himself whisper the word, "Help!" and then he lost consciousness. When he awoke, he could not tell if he had fainted or had been asleep for hours or even days. The pain was gone. His body felt pleasant and warm. He felt his hair being stroked and opened both eyes. He still had difficulties focusing, but could tell clearly enough what was happening in front of him. The lead hunter knelt to the side of his face and was gently running its claws through the android's hair. It was purring like a pet cat. The heat in the throne room was building up. Steam was pouring out of the mine shaft. A watery mist drifted along the corridors of the castle. The mist took on the form of tentacles, seeping from the other world and manoeuvring a gossamer-like web around them. Chopra could sense they were merely minutes away from the opening of the gateway. One of the 3 Chthons began to hum a sorrowful melody. Although it was wordless, Chopra recognized the tune and the homesick sentiments inspiring the ancient lullaby. The Chthon was rocking his head to and fro. Chopra began to join in. His voice echoed his fellow Chthons' morose singing. The song was one sung by all Chthons as death approached. Stories were told of whole communities sitting down and wailing the old tune whilst waiting for the slave masters to arrive and incarcerate their bodies and souls. Swarf turned, screaming for them to stop. This was his triumph. He would soon be rich. Chopra could see into his mind. The shape-changer could not face up to his failure. With only 5 Chthons left, there would be no mass production of the drug. Swarf thought he could come to this world, steal the treasures of another race, and escape with immortality and immeasurable riches. There was no escape. "Stop it!" shouted Swarf. The Chthons didn't listen. The 3rd Chthon was also swaying and chanting a welcome to death. The shape-changer's mind was confused. Swarf was panicking. He had lost control and didn't know what to do. Suddenly, Swarf lunged forward, grabbed one of the Chthons and strangled him. Swarf smiled in triumph, letting the body fall onto the ground. The singing stopped. "No," Chopra shouted. "It is over for us all. Let us make our peace before we die." "You can see the signs, but you can't read them," said Swarf. "I promised you riches beyond the avarice of man, and you shall have them." Bernice decided that Elle had been watching too many films. She had suggested that one of them should pretend to be ill, shout for help, and then, when one of their captors responded, the others should attack him. Elle had once seen a vid film where that had been used for an escape bid. Bernice had seen a number of films where that had succeeded, and, more importantly, thought it likely that everybody had seen at least one film where that less-than-daring idea had been tried. Thomas was apathetic, and said he would go along with whatever plans everybody else had. "We're not arranging a night out, you know," Bernice said. Bernice agreed to lie on the ground and moan. Thomas stood behind the door. The 3 of them shouted, and eventually a Chthon approached the cell. It looked through the small door window, asked what was going on, and then told them all to stand back. It entered, and Thomas struck it. Elle smiled. "I don't believe it," Bernice said, coming to the conclusion that the Chthons didn't have many cinemas. The Chthon had been killed instantly. Bernice felt sorry, but thought many more would die before they escaped from the castle. They had decided that they should not walk up the staircase to the throne room, but find another route to approach their captors. They took the torch with them. One of the typewriter creatures was following them. It seemed to be watching them. As they walked through the dungeons, Bernice saw blood-splattered walls and rusty instruments of pain. She was frightened. There were weird sounds and feelings brewing in the castle. The winds brushing through the tunnels and stairways had an unnatural quality to them. There were also other things moving around and making their presence felt. Suddenly, all 3 of them froze as one of the inner walls appeared to vibrate and move. The stone walls seemed to buckle. The prisoners didn't wait to identify the cause of the disturbance, but quickly carried on. Elle pointed to scratch marks on the wall, which she said had just appeared. Thomas said that the 2 women were very suggestible, that it was just the wind, and that the claw marks were certainly many centuries old. Bernice saw something which she didn't point out to her companions. It was a crest. She had first seen it on one of the standards fluttering in the throne room. It was also carved onto a number of the walls, as if to ward off evil. She had finally recognized it. She didn't know what it meant, but had seen it in some of the old books in the Doctor's TARDIS. It was the mark of the Time Lords of Gallifrey. It was called the Seal of Rassilon. "That was lucky," Blake said, as they watched the 3 prisoners escape from the dungeon. "There is no blind chance," Copyion said. The screen flickered. They had seen the argument between the Chthons and the shape-changer. Now the Doctor's companion, the woman and the android were walking through the dark corridors of the castle, trying to find some means of escape. Blake couldn't understand what was happening in front of him. The moving pictures on the wall seemed to be of events occurring elsewhere on the planet, or in the universe, across the ages. But the events were all going on now. "I created this whole planet using Gallifreyan technology," said Copyion. "Its purpose is to monitor the Iskaroth." I knew they would return, perhaps tomorrow, in a year, or in 1,000,000 years, but they would be back. I have stood guard across the centuries." Blake looked at the old man. Copy Ion sat on a chair, staring out of half-blind eyes at the screens and eating dates from a little box on his lap. Copy Ion's body seemed decayed, only able to move due to sheer strength of will. "But why have the Time Lords kept this great war a secret?" the Doctor asked. He had seemed to be sulking. He was sitting on the floor with his legs crossed, and had said nothing for over an hour. Copy Ion's refusal to answer any of his previous questions had irritated the Time Lord. "I am sorry, Doctor. Do you want the truth?" "Yes." The Doctor looked suspiciously at him. "It is a history lesson, but one that you will never have heard before." Gallifrey was an advanced civilization. Across the sentient worlds of the galaxy, we were treated as gods. Our people were happy. We created works of art that could not even be imagined by lesser races. We pushed our bodies even further and devised whole new theories and systems to improve our way of life. We believed in God. We were a spiritual race. We prayed. And then it started. Philosophers argued about the existence of God. And then the scientists stated that we were alone in the universe, that we made our own destiny. There were many ideas, debates, and arguments about our place in the cosmos. And one of our greatest scientists, Rassilon, announced that he had discovered the principles of time travel. All we had to do was harness the power of a black hole. Copy Ion shook his head. And the fools tried it. They exploded the most powerful device ever created inside a black hole. Do you know what they did? According to our history, they discovered the power to drive the experiments in time, the Doctor replied. No. That was much later. The initial experiment went horribly wrong. They pierced the fabric of our universe like a gunshot that ripped open the whole of space and time. They created holes throughout the cosmos, from our universe to the other side of the black hole. The other side. And then they came. Monsters, hideous monsters in their hordes. Star systems were destroyed. Billions died. The war went on for over 1,000 years. And we were responsible. This isn't true, the Doctor said. And then, after the war, the newly formed High Council set themselves up as the Time Lords. But Gallifreyan history isn't like that. Your history is a lie. When I returned from the war, I wished I was dead. I saw a people half destroyed by plague. The virus had annihilated all those who knew of Rassilon's great mistake. A sole warrior survived the eternal war. But he soon died. Most of the great men died. Rassilon had become the first president of the Time Lords of Gallifrey. He talked of science and reason, the rule of law. I argued. It was evil which we had fought, dark, desperate evil. I had seen things which no one should ever see. But they were not interested, Rassilon and the scientists. They talked of the end of superstition and dread. The truth did not suit them. They rewrote history. They were technologically advanced. They sat in their ivory towers. But the Time Lords were immoral. I could tell you so much. How, in another experiment, a scientist was sent into a black hole and was supposedly killed by the force of the explosion. He wasn't. He was sealed in there to prevent him ever telling of Rassilon's great mistake. I escaped, to keep a lone guard against an ancient and bitter enemy. The Doctor had stood up and was pacing around the room. He didn't seem able to agree with this version of his people's history. Blake didn't know what to think. He didn't agree with Copy Ion. He saw scientists and thinkers as exploring the universe, pushing forward their place in the universe. They had eaten of the forbidden fruit of knowledge and had been cast out of paradise. He didn't think there was a God. He had seen no signs of his existence in his journey with the Doctor. I don't understand how you knew they would come back here, to this time at this place in the universe. I can see it's happening, but why here and now? Blake asked. It's very simple. The monsters want my body and soul. They want vengeance. I see, said Blake. I doubt whether you could understand how it feels to know for all eternity that the creations of hell are pursuing you, Copyion said. Can we get into the castle? The Doctor asked. He was clearly concerned about his companion. I've heard what you've said. I don't know whether I believe you, but I feel powerless standing here. There is a path, but it would be playing our hand too early. We would not be able to tell what the enemy's intentions are this time, Copyion replied. He offered Blake and the Doctor a date. Both declined. But Bernice might die, the Doctor said, exasperated. Yes, she might, said Copyion. Bernice stopped. She couldn't go any further forward. She pointed to the wall in front of them. Thomas couldn't see and bent forwards. Don't, she said. Why not? Thomas asked, and then he saw it as well. In the centre of the wall was a crack. It was only a narrow mark on the wall, but all around seeped the red death. The paralysis bubbled and oozed through the small hole. This was worse than they had thought. The castle was not sealed off, and their lives were in utmost danger. Get back, said Thomas. No, Elle said. We've got to carry on. He looked at her. We only have a short time, Elle said. Before Bernice could reply, Elle had walked past the red paralysis and had started to run down the corridor. She seemed to have lost interest in her companions. After you, Bernice said to the android. He smiled a thank you. They shuffled past the paralysis. What's she running for? Bernice asked. Perhaps she's scared, suggested Thomas. I doubt it. Come on, we'd better keep an eye on her. They continued to walk along the corridors of the dungeons until they came to another stairway. Bernice turned and faced the typewriter creature that was following them. I hope we're doing the right thing, Doctor, she said. She smiled and then began to climb the stairs to the ground level in the shape changer. As she did, a cold shiver ran down her back.